welcome everybody. As Austin said, we're glad to have you all here again this evening for our second foray into the digital world of Northwest Voices. So we hope in the near future we'll be able to do more in-person ones, but for now, this is still our best way to connect readers and authors together. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of John, and we'll, again, as Austin said, he'll play the video again, and then we'll let John loose on all of you. So I just do want to mention that Northwest Voices is funded by the Longview Public Library Friends and the Longview Library Foundation, and has in the past by the LCC Associated Student Body, as well as the LCC Foundation. So they've been very helpful to us for all these almost over 20 years now of doing these programs. So after a 42-year career in journalism that culminated in his work as editor and publisher of the Daily World in Aberdeen, John C. Hughes became the chief oral historian at the Office of the Secretary of State. He graduated from the University of Puget Sound, which actually, John, I didn't tell you before, that's where both my parents graduated from, the University of Maryland, and is currently a trustee of the Washington State Historical Society. In 2004, he won the June Anderson Almquist Award for Distinguished Service to Journalism. The book Julia Butler Hansen, A Trailblazing Washington Politician, is his 12th published book. And I should also mention that about a month ago or so, he was also a guest on the library's podcast, Your Shelf or Mine. So if you haven't discovered that yet, please go to the library's website and you can find the podcast and see old episodes, see new episodes. It's a great podcast. I think you'll enjoy a lot of the topics that we talk about.
Before we get going, I'd like to give a shout out to some books that I've read in the past 3 months that I think are really important. One of those is my friend Cassandra Tate's book called Unsettled Ground, about the Whitman Massacre and its the shifting legacy of the legend of that massacre and putting it in better perspective. It's really an important book. Cassandra's a PhD who can really write, and I think that Unsettled Ground is one of the most important books about Northwest history that I've read in a long time. The other one is called One Mighty and Irresistible Tide by Jia Lin Yang, and it documents the epic struggle over American immigration from 1924 to 1965. And it really brings into sharp focus the current spate of anti-immigrant bias, the virus that's hate against Asian Americans. And then on that same tact, there's a new book by someone I'm proud to call a friend, and that's Daniel James Brown, author of the New York Times bestseller, deservedly so, The Boys in the Boat. That if you listen to The Boys in the Boat, by the way, it's one of those driveway moments or pulling over to the side of the freeway as the University of Washington crew is coming from behind on the Hudson or in Berlin to win the gold medal. His new book is called Facing the Mountain, and it's something that Daniel and I collaborated. I'd like to think that I was part of the spark for that book, because a piece I did about the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an all-volunteer Japanese outfit from World War II, is the inspiration for this book. And it's coming out in May, and I haven't seen an advanced copy, but knowing Daniel and his gift for narration, I think it's going to be really something. Well, one of the great things about getting to talk about Julia Butler Hansen to an audience in Cowlitz County is that if this is like a presentation I've given in Lacey and Tumwater into the King County Library, there are people out there who knew Julia Butler Hansen as just a force of nature. In fact, in the last one, I made the acquaintance, albeit electronically, of a fella who, as a teenager, had been hired by Julia to mow his lawn and to prune her immaculate garden there in Cathlamet with its boxwood hedges and lilacs. And he told me that one day that he got over aggressive in pruning one of her trees, and Julia went into a rage and fired him on the spot. The next day, he presented himself in abject humiliation and apologized, and she sort of patted him on the shoulder and said it'd be all right. But that's really vintage Julia. it's hard to know where to begin when you talk about Julia, because almost all of the stories about Julia have the added advantage of being true, and the anecdotes are just legion. In 1967, I write, she became the most powerful woman in the United States Congress. And this happened through a bit of happenstance. The one fellow who was ahead of her in the pecking order to become head of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on the Interior was defeated, and another fellow was the chairman of another subcommittee, so he couldn't do two. And Julie, after only 7 years in Congress, got this plum assignment. And consider this, it was not just any committee. She controlled the billion-dollar budgets for the Department of the Interior and related agencies, including the U.S. Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Bureau of Land Management. She also had purview over the related agencies of the Smithsonian Institution and the Arts and Humanities. So, and at the same time, Henry M. Jackson, whose campaign poster is over my shoulder tonight, and was a family friend, was the chairman of the Interior Committee in the United States Senate. So between them, they were absolutely in the catbird seat to really deliver for all of the lunch bucket and environmental and natural resource fishing, lumbering, geodesic survey, you name it. And how she got there is pretty amazing, because you consider that she was born in Cathlamet, and I looked long and hard to try to find if there had been anyone from a smaller town than Cathlamet, Washington, ever elected to the United States Congress. And those of you who are in Longview, where I once lived happily in junior high school, doubtless you've been to Cathlamet. And when you arrive in Cathlamet on a foggy morning, as the town's kind of emerging from the mist along the Columbia River sloughs, it reminds me of Brigadoon. It's like here the village coming out of the fog of the moors. And Main Street in Cathlamet, with the historic Hansen home on one end and the Domet Brothers General Store on the other, is hardly changed since Julia's girlhood in 1907. I don't know how the hotel that reopened and is really lovely was refurbished is doing in this terrible pandemic, but hopefully this too shall pass and we'll rediscover what a charming place that is. And when you go all the way down the Columbia there, I mean, you can drive down a country road past the covered bridge there, and all of a sudden you come out into a clearing, and off in the distance is the Astoria-Megler Bridge that Julia helped to build, in this whole amazing array. When you think of what Lewis and Clark must have thought when they finally rounded that bend there and saw the mouth of the great river of the West, it must have been just remarkable. At any rate, so Julia is born in 1907, grows up in Cathlamet. Her mother, who deserves a biography of her own, Maud Kimball Butler, historian, watercolorist, suffragette, was just this remarkable person. She was elected Wahkiakum County Superintendent of Schools at the age of 23 in 1907. In 1903 at the age of 23. And that was a first for a woman. And it really galled Maud Kimball Butler that she got herself elected, but she couldn't vote for herself because women were still deprived of the vote. And Julia's grandmother, her namesake grandmother, Julia Ann Blood, was also a suffragist in the trenches there. And so in the ramp up to 1910, when the women of Washington won the right to vote 10 years ahead of the 19th Amendment, they were just indefatigable. Julia's mom was active in the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Girl Scouts, the Red Cross. It was Order of Eastern Star, and she traveled around and met a lot of famous suffragists and politicians. So Julia grew up in this milieu of a small town that was also a county seat town, where the riverboats arrived several times a day and dislodged passengers to visit the courthouse or do business or unload mail and other goods. And it was really a remarkable childhood that she had. During that suffrage campaign in 1910, Julia's grandmother wrote an article where she said, "Here I am, a literate woman who knows what the government's all about, and I'm completely exasperated that I can't vote while illiterate men are prancing down to vote on election day after being plied with alcohol by political hacks and told how to cast their ballots." So that was the milieu that Julia grew up in. And there were a lot of overnight visitors to the Hansen home there at that end of Main Street. The visiting politicians, visiting Superior Court judge from Pacific County, and Julia just soaked it all up. And she, early on during the Wilson campaign, Julia had her own little Declaration of Independence and decided that although her father, her mother, the father, by the way, was the Wahkiakum County Sheriff, were staunch Republicans, as were most people in Washington State prior to the coming of the New Deal. But Julia got some handbills for Woodrow Wilson and some campaign buttons and was passing them out, and her grandmother snatched them out of her hand and threw them in the trash, and Julia was indignant herself. And she was a really remarkable girl. The best thing, by the way, that about doing this biography is that when I set out, I met with Julia's son, David, who is a retired Fort Vancouver curator, a master's degree in history from the University of Washington. And he told me that he had his mother's diaries that she began keeping at the age of 14, his grandmother's diaries, and that it was carte blanche. He would share them with me. And they are a movable feast. When you talk about primary sources, there's two librarians here and probably a lot of other library patrons who also know that Julia, her aspiration from childhood was to become a writer. She wanted to become a journalist, but when she ended up at the University of Washington, she found out that it would be tough sledding for women in journalism, that she'd end up writing society stories, weddings and engagements and that sort of thing, and that had no interest for her. So she loved to cook too, and she got a degree in home economics. And in the middle of the Depression, she set off for Bellingham, where her mother had received her degree from the Teachers College, and opened a tea room. She ended up giving away most of the food out the back door to homeless and hungry people every night, and really became, at that time, together with her mother, an FDR Democrat. The whole family turned on its heel and rejected Herbert Hoover and became dyed-in-the-wool New Deal Democrats. Julia's gumption is just legendary. When she was elected to the Cathlamet City Council, she was the first woman, and before long, she was mayor pro tem. She was heading the Utilities Committee. Cathlamet was working on putting in modern sewerage and building some roads. Julia always said that back in the day, before the late 1930s, Cathlamet's roads were really the river. I mean, the traffic was there on riverboats and steamboats. And when her real amazing accomplishment was in 1938, just before she would put her hat in the ring to run for the Washington legislature, she had steamrolled a committee to build the Puget Island Bridge. Now, most of you know that Puget Island is this lovely, prosaic, pastoral place smack dab in the middle of the Columbia River. And back in the day, there were mint farms there. But today, when you drive across the now Julia Butler Hansen Bridge, connecting Cathlamet to Puget Island, and there's that wonderful little charming ferry on the other side that can take you over to the Oregon side. Well, it's just magical. It's like that whole end of the river there. So she came after the tea room failed in Bellingham. She came back to Cathlamet and holed up in the house and started doing a research for a children's book about the Oregon Trail that ended up being called Singing Paddles. It had Lewis and Clark and Indians and the pioneers, and there's this young brother and sister who are the protagonists on this Oregon Trail journey. And an amazing thing happened in 1935. Singing Paddles was named by the forerunner of the Caldecott Awards, then called the Julia Ellsworth Ford Foundation, as one of 1935's top 6 works of juvenile fiction. And Julia got a check in the mail for $200. And that's about $3,500 today. But more than the money, which was really a godsend in the middle of the Depression, she achieved something that she absolutely counted as priceless. From then on, she always listed her occupation as writer. That's what she was. So in the middle of that, after winning that award, she got a job at the county courthouse in the county engineer's office. And before long, the guys on the road crews thought that Julia, as the timekeeper and payroll clerk and order of blacktop and all that, was absolutely wonderful because she could cuss like a logger. She smoked like a chimney, and she was an absolutely great storyteller. But there's this shapeshifter thing about Julia, is that on the one hand, she could be, as they dubbed her, the little old lady in logging boots and Madam Queen and the Duchess of Cathlamet. But when she was at a DAR meeting or a Zana Club meeting, she was absolutely the personification of pinkies in the air and who poured the tea and gentility. So when Gregory Peck, by the way, and I'll bet there's some people out there who can remember it because I sure can, when Gregory Peck came to Longview in 1968 to salute Julia for her works on the arts and humanities, he turned to her aide, Alan Thompson, who was a newspaper publisher and one of her successors in the legislature. He said, "This woman's amazing. She could be an actress." And Alan said, "Oh, she is an actress. You don't know the half of it. She's pretty amazing." Her sister-in-law, about this time, when she was campaigning for the Washington legislature in 1938, had a wonderful quote. And she said, she would drive 100 miles to meet with a dozen people, and there were no freeways back then. She'd see a farmer out in his field. She'd stop the car, pull on some overshoes, and climb right through a barbed wire fence or blackberry vines. When she'd come back and we'd worry about the scratches, she'd say, "It'll heal." She'd wipe off the blood and the mud, and she'd say, "He's an old friend," or "He's got problems I should know about." And that is a master of retail politics. Scoop Jackson and Henry M. Jackson, whom she met as young Democrats in 1938, said that there was just nobody better than her on the campaign trail. The other thing that's interesting is that by the time she got to Congress, people in Washington, D.C. and around the state knew something that the people in the 3rd Congressional District had long since taken for granted, that Julia liked to be called just Julia. Mind you, her staff always called her Mrs. Hansen or Congresswoman, but everyone else, including headline writers, she was Julia. It was sort of like Dixie the Array, who never complained whenever anybody used Dixie in a headline. Someone once said, "Wasn't that disrespectful? She's the governor." And Dixie said, "No, I like it." And Julia felt the same way. And after a while in the 60s, her campaign buttons, all they said was Julia in this unique script. So as she was getting the Puget Island Bridge built, she got FDR's campaign manager and postmaster general, James Farley, to hook up this telegraph wire to be the master of ceremonies for this gala that was there. There were like 5,000 people in Cathlamet, and FDR from the Oval Office hit the golden telegraph and opened the bridge. And then the money started rolling in for Julia's campaign. Then a very important thing happened. Julia Butler met John M. McClellan Sr. and his son, John M. McClellan Jr. John M. McClellan Sr. was the founder, owner, editor, publisher of the Longview Daily News. His son, John Jr., whom I knew well, a remarkable man, was the managing editor. And their nephew, who a good friend of mine during my years as an editor, Ted Nat, came into the scene in the 1960s. They adored Julia. They were Republicans, but they thought that she just had all the moxie and saw in her a lunch bucket Democrat who had just this common touch. And she developed this remarkable interest in highway planning. And during World War II, when the Wahkiakum County engineer was called off to active duty in the military, Julia took over as acting engineer. And the guys on the road crews said, you know, she could probably run a road grader if we'd let her, and she would have liked it too. I'll let you guys get a word in edgewise here in this soliloquy of mine, because as you can tell, I get kind of excited all over again when I think about Julia Butler Hansen. By the way, I met her in 1960 when I was a freshman at Grace Harbor College, and she had just been elected to Congress. I misspoke. It was 1961. She was elected in 1960, and it was one of those moments you never forget, just a bigger-in-life character. I've got two people here as moderators. Do you want to jump in a minute at all, Phyllis?
Sure, absolutely. Well, let me say first, this book was tremendously enjoyable read. What a wonderful narrative, and you do a great job.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
The diaries propelled it. Imagine if Doris Kearns Goodwin had Abraham Lincoln's diaries or Mary Todd Lincoln's diaries. I mean, it was just amazing.
Yeah, the access seems incredible. Is this a book that you had been contemplating for a long time?
Since about 1960 when I met her. I mean, she was just a friend of mine. Went to work for her as her press secretary later on, and then by the time by 1966, I was out of college, out of the military, and became a political reporter at the Aberdeen Daily World, which Julia, as much as Cowlitz County loved Julia Butler Hansen, and by the way, there were a lot of old, unrepentant Republican farmers in Wahkiakum County who were glad that Julia got them the money for the dike and the levee when there were the floods and got crop money and all that. Well, nevertheless, when a good Republican came along, they'd vote for him. So Cowlitz County never varied, though. Julia's seatmate was a guy named J.K. Van Buskirk, a pulp mill worker from Longview, and they were a tag team for quite a while until the Republicans were resurgent in the 1940s and bumped off him, but that didn't last long. There was pretty soon another Democrat running for Julia. And the amazing thing about Julia Butler Hansen was that Julia, when she got to Congress, get this, carried Lewis County. And we know some wag once said that Lewis County was the last redoubt of the fallout shelter industry. They would, if there's a yellow dog Democrat in Texas, there's got to be a yellow dog Republican in Lewis County that they'd vote for, even if he had the most tawdry record. But she was a pretty conservative Democrat in a lot of ways, and she knew how to tread that middle road. There's a really great story that I'd like to share about what happened in 1945. By then, Julia was an absolute power in the legislature on both highways and education. And her mother had been a deputy superintendent in public instruction. And so Julia was a great champion of the teachers. And in 1945, she shepherded through the Washington legislature a major bill that reformed pensions, contract provisions for teachers. And the Democrat governor was a guy named Mon Walgren, who was a tough old Paul from Everett, who had been a poker-playing, whiskey-drinking buddy of Harry S. Truman. And the I'll get to that question too. What might Julia think of the polarized Congress of the present day? Well, my story builds on that. She'd hate it, for one thing. But in 1945, Walgren saw fit to veto Julia's pension plan, and she was livid, absolutely livid. She blew her stack. What did she say? She called it a cruel veto that did not recognize the necessities of humanity or the state's paramount duty to provide children with the best possible education. The veto was a smoke screen and intended to discredit teacher organizations, she said. And by the way, the Longview Daily News and the Vancouver Columbian and the Aberdeen World and all of Julia's fan club went ballistic. For one thing, there were a bunch of Republican publishers and they hated Walgren because in 1944, he had defeated the boy wonder Art Langley and made him a one-term governor. So Walgren sent his fixer, his henchman, a guy named Jerry O'Connell, who had been a left-wing Montana congressman, to Wahkiakum and Cowlitz County and prodded the Democratic Central Committees to read Julia out of the party. Shades of poor Jamie. And for having the temerity of saying that there was actually a free and fair election. So, and by the way, I have conjured up in today's headlines how Julia Butler Hansen would have sent a letter to the 3rd District Republican Congresswoman for having the courage of her convictions. So Jerry O'Connell got the Wahkiakum and Cowlitz County Democratic Central Committees to banish Julia. Julia was in the middle of this, Julia got pregnant with David, her first child, only child, and she was fed up with politics. And even though the McClellans and others said, hey, stay the course, stand by your colors, stay the game, we'd like to see you in the governor's chair. And so Julia is recovering from her pregnancy at the Cowlitz County Hospital, and the McClellans come and say, you got to run for re-election, and if you do, we'll raise the money. You won't have to do anything, none of that pesky stuff that you hate, and because we need you. Well, Julia ran as an independent Democrat, and she kicked butt. She was elected to her 5th term in the legislature, and the next year, the Wahkiakum and Cowlitz County Democratic Central Committee said, all is forgiven. We would like you back. I don't know why we did that, why we would do that. And fast forward to 1948, Arthur Langley, stunning comeback, ousts Mon Walgren, the guy who defeated him 4 years earlier, and is elected to a 2nd term as governor. And when they passed in the hallway to the opening session of the legislature, Julia looked at the governor and said, welcome back, Governor. And he said, it's good to see you too, Mrs. Hansen. And so that is just absolutely vintage Julia Butler Hansen. David Hansen had a great quote. He said, Mother had high expectations and low patience. She was a combination of General Patton and John Wayne, and her tongue lashings were a lot worse than her spankings. David tells this story. He's a great storyteller. He says that there were times that he was just terrified of her. And when he was about 6, she was on the way out to a meeting and she shoved a bowl of Rice Krispies in front of him and poured some milk on it. And he kind of balked at it. She picked it up the bowl and lobbed it at him, and he ducked and it hit the floor. And they looked at one another and they both started to laugh. And then I would be remiss in any talk about the legendary story that my friend, former Senate Majority Leader Sid Snyder, the legendary grocer from Long Beach, told about what happened in 1939 when a male lawmaker insulted Julia after she made her first remarks as a freshman. And he says, he cornered her afterward and said, that was really out of place. You should never do that again. You are a freshman and you are only a woman. And Julia looked at him and said, you'd better apologize or take your glasses off. And he said, why would I do that? He said, because I'm going to hit you. And according to many sources, she did just that. She decked the guy. And Snyder said, he had this wonderful quote when I interviewed him a lot long before he left us. He said, you know, even if it wasn't true, it could have been, because a lot of other people told stories about the guys that Julia jabbed in the chest or punched. And Bob Bailey, her district aide, who was a great friend of mine, state senator from the South Bend, and a port commissioner, and later a utilities commissioner, a remarkable storyteller. He said that when he was her district aide, she was standing on the steps of the Capitol, and a lobbyist came up and draped an arm around her shoulders and said, Julia, Julia, and she swatted his arm away and said, get your goddamn meat hooks off me. I'm not for sale. And that guy never had the temerity to come around again. So these stories about her moxie and her charisma are pretty amazing. Julia always said that she strived above all to be a prayerful Christian Scientist. She and her mother were very prayerful disciples of Mary Baker Eddy. But David, who's also a graduate of Principia College, a Christian Science school, said, yeah, but if you're a true Christian Science, you're not supposed to drink, cuss, or smoke, all of which Julia did with alacrity. We fast forward to 1949. Langley's in office. Julia becomes the first woman to head the Roads and Bridges Committee of the Washington State House of Representatives. And by 1952, she is the first woman and then the chairman of the 11 Western State Interstate Committee on Highway Planning. And then she is the chairman of the Interim Committee on Highways of the Washington Legislature, which by 1956 is responsible for working with Dwight Eisenhower's Interstate Highway program to create modern highways. There's a really great sub-theme in this story. Julia was an admirer of Eisenhower's highway planning and knew the story that I tell in this book that really derived from the fact that as a young tank captain during World War II, Eisenhower was delegated to make a trek across America on its rudimentary roads to see how America would fare if it needed logistically to move munitions and min material across country. And it took like weeks. And then as Supreme Allied Commander in World War II, Eisenhower and Patton made great use of Hitler's vaunted Autobahn to move into the heart of the Third Reich. So in a bipartisan legislation that Julia had a key role in the 1950s, the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, what came to be called the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, was born. I need to answer the question that one of our patrons voiced earlier. What would Julia think of today's polarized Congress? She would be appalled. She was a great foe of the Electoral College, introduced legislation to abandon the Electoral College, felt that it was an antiquated system, and that direct election was the only fair way. If you won popular vote, you ought to be elected. She worked masterfully across the aisle in Congress with Gerald Ford, the minority leader. She worked later with a whole succession of really amazing Republican and Democratic congresswomen, notably Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, whom Julia revered for her portrait and courage during the McCarthy Red Scare, to denounce McCarthy as being the second coming of Goebbels as the big lie, trumping up the notion that communists would infiltrated every echelon of government and throwing out with reckless abandon, with no decency, as someone said. And during the 1950s, Julia moved to subvert the activities of a McCarthy disciple named Albert Canwell in the Washington legislature in his own little kangaroo court of un-American activities. She was long proud of that. So the answer would be that Julia would be appalled by the lack of bipartisanship. She would be appalled at she rarely cried, but she would have been reduced to tears by the notion of a mob storming the halls of the United States Congress. So let's digress here and talk about a really remarkable thing that happened in 1958 in a story that I was able to verify for this book with some notarized affidavits that David Hansen had acquired. In the 3rd Congressional District, there was a very, very popular Republican congressman. His name was Russell V. Mack. He was the publisher of the Grace Harbor Washingtonian, the Morning Daily in Hoquiam, great friend of the McClellans and all the other Republican-oriented newspaper publishers in the state. And not only that, but he did a very good job of representing the blue-collar interests of the 3rd District: timber, fishing, roads, levees, dikes, ports. And he was, from 1947, when he was first elected, he was virtually unbeatable. However, in 1958, an amazing thing happened. Julia had achieved such stature in the Democratic Party and as a campaigner that they figured she was the only person who had a chance to reclaim that seat for the Democrats. And it had long been held by the Democrats since the coming of the New Deal. In 1958, one day in Cathlamet, in the late summer, there arrived at the Hansen home on Main Street in Cathlamet, Washington, a delegation to persuade Julia to run for Congress. It was led by Warren Magnuson and Henry M. Jackson, our United States senators, the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This is just a remarkable development. Kennedy had been conducting racketeering hearings in Tacoma into the Teamsters Union with his brother Bobby as chief counsel for that committee. And it had to be, and Sam Rayburn was visiting friends in Yakima. So it had to be that Scoop and Maggie convinced the Speaker of the House and the likely candidate, aspiring candidate for the United States presidency, John F. Kennedy, to visit Julia. And so she announced her candidacy against Russell Mack. In the middle of the campaign, her mother had a heart attack and she withdrew. That could have been the end of it right then and there, but when a dramatic, unexpected, eventful thing occurred on the floor of the House of the United States Congress in 1960, Russell Mack was talking to a good friend in the well of the House, and the friend said, "It's a good day, isn't it, Russell?" And Mack said, "Not for me, it isn't." And with that, he keeled over backward and died. Julia did something amazing that Sid Snyder and Robert Bailey and others, namely one of my favorite teachers from Monticello Junior High School, Arlie DeJarnett, always said, what a prince of a guy he was. The phone began ringing immediately after Mack had died. Everyone wanted to know, well, was Julia going to run? And she said these words: "Can't we let the gentleman just rest in peace? Wouldn't it be so much more decorous and genteel if we just honored Russell Mack's service in the United States Congress, serving the people of the 3rd Congressional District, before we started lining up like a group of old Pauls, ambitiously jockeying for his seat?" And that went over really well. She was elected handily to both the unexpired term of Mack's and a full term, and that gave her an advance in seniority by a couple of months in entering the U.S. Congress. Another great thing happened. Someone asked about bipartisanship and what would she think today. The first woman elected to Congress from Washington State was Catherine May, a Republican from Yakima. Julia and Catherine had roomed together in Olympia during a couple of legislative sessions and were good friends. Talk about bipartisanship. They'd come home after a session, put on their bunny slippers and make tea and talk about politics. So when Julia got to Congress, Catherine May hosted her, and so did Margaret Chase Smith. And there were only about, forgive me, I think there were about 12 women in Congress at that time, and they were all together. And those Republican women, like Margaret Chase Smith, were, for the most part, old Teddy Roosevelt progressives, and they were proto-feminists. And so if you fast forward to the 1970s, Julia is in the trenches, helping pass the Equal Rights Amendment, working with the LBJ when he succeeded Kennedy to create a whole series of those landmark Great Society pieces of legislation. And interestingly, I also discovered, I hope many of our viewers and friends here tonight have read some of Robert Caro's magisterial biographies of LBJ. They're the best ever. I've never read any. His painstaking attention to detail, his narrative skills. He even has a new book out called Working, a small book that talks about the craft of interviewing and how he blocks out a story. But I found an instance in 1944, I believe it was, when FDR was running for an unprecedented third term, and Wendell Willkie, the barefoot boy from Wall Street, who was a former Democrat, was opposing him. Well, the Republicans seemed resurgent. And Martin F. Smith, a Democratic congressman from Hoquiam, who was a friend of Julia's, sent a telegram to the Congressional Campaign Committee, who just happened to be a young Texas congressman named Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson was so shrewd that he wanted that to be in the catbird seat for that Congressional Campaign Committee, because he could dole out money and win friends and influence for years to come. Well, Martin F. Smith got 2 checks in the mail to buy ads in the Longview Daily News and the Columbian and the Waukegan County Eagle, and won. And that was the first time that Julia wrote in her diary that she'd ever heard about Lyndon Baines Johnson. So Julia, as you might imagine, when she got to Congress, was a huge New Frontiers woman because of her the way she revered John F. Kennedy. But she was also appalled by the way the Kennedys treated Lyndon Johnson, who, after all, had been the master of the Senate, this brilliant parliamentarian. And so they made fun of him and called him Uncle Cornpone and made fun of Lady Bird. So one day, Lyndon called Julia and said, "Hey, I'm going to go dedicate a dam. Would you like to fly out on Air Force Two with me?" And on the way out, over innumerable packs of Chesterfields and glasses of whiskey, Lyndon Johnson and Julia Butler Hansen bonded. And that was a match made in heaven, because 2 old Pauls who really knew how to work stuff just really were a match made in heaven. There's a photo that I have that shows Lyndon Johnson in a ballroom with his toddler grandson, Lynn, in his arms. And he spots Julia across the room, and there's this sequence of photos, and he rushes over to her, and he forks over the kid, and they tickle the kid, and they just look like they're just having the time of their life. And that's the way they were. And the sad thing, of course, was that Julia jumped ship on Vietnam by 1968 and predicted presciently that the Vietnam War would be the ruination of the Democratic Party. It was a war without end. It was a dead end, and Johnson was disappointed. But when they dedicated the LBJ Library, one of the guests of honor was still Julia Butler Hansen. So here I am again, running off at the mouth about this fabulous character. Talk to me, fellas. This shouldn't be a monologue, and I bet people have questions out there.
Yeah, there's another one here from on the chat, John. So Julian, Catherine May, and Edith Green formed quite
Yes.
an unusual regional
Yes,
female
yes.
congressional delegation during the era. Did this have an impact on legislation?
It absolutely did, because Edith Green represented the district right across the Columbia from Julia. And they were philosophically two peas in the pod. If I remember correctly, one of Edith Green's great campaigns, and then there was Maureen Neuberger, the U.S. Senator from Oregon, and whom Julia adored as well. I think Edith was, one of her great campaigns was to working with the Surgeon General to brand smoking as for its the deadly cancer-causing agent that it was. And she always said to Julia, you got to stop smoking. But Julia had been smoking since college. And by the way, tragically, smoking led to cancer that in the end killed Julia. It started out on her nose and metastasized, and really a tragic end. One of the things I wish that we could still, before this is over, play that video, because in it, there's a remarkable vignette. When Julia was the chairman of the, she hated chairwoman, by the way. As a writer, she also hated chair. She said, don't call me a chair. A chair is an object. I'm not a chair. I want to be chairman. Chairman's fine. It's really gender neutral if we look at it. And so anyway, as chairman of the interim committees, highway on committees, somebody's talking about bunny slippers. Julie had bunny slippers and moccasins, so did Catherine. In 1958, there was a brilliant young up-and-coming Republican elected to the House from Seattle named Daniel Jackson Evans. He's a civil engineer, Eagle Scout, just the most clean-cut, handsome, articulate guy you'd ever want to meet. And he was the leader of the latter-day Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Bull Moose Republicans. And Julia said one day to the Republican, when there was an opening on the interim committee, she said, I want Dan Evans. And then a Democrat said, he's a Republican, he's a freshman. Why would you do that? That's a seat that goes to a senior representative. And she said, he's a civil engineer, roads are bipartisan, appoint him. And they appointed him, and the rest is history. So when Julia left Congress in 1975, the first call she got was from Daniel J. Evans, who said, say, I've got a new job for you. I would like you to be on the Highway Commission. And she said, that's a wonderful job, Governor. I'd love to do that. So he repaid the favor. And before it was over, before she stepped down in 1981, she became a key agent in the reorganization of the Highway Commission into the modern multimodal Transportation Commission and the chairwoman of that commission. So can we play that video?
Yeah, let me.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Let's go for that. Third time's the charm, fellas. Because only the lip readers got the full flavor of that.
I know. Okay.
I never was raised in this philosophy of setting myself aside because I was a woman, because I just never felt like that. When the boys played baseball on the block, I played baseball, hardball. When the boys played football on the block, I played football. I might go to fisticuffs, but I never dissolve in tears.
Reporters dubbed her Mrs. Highways and the little old lady in logging boots. Practically everyone else just called her Julia.
She'd see a farmer out in his field. She'd stop the car, pull on some overshoes, and climb right through a barbed wire fence or blackberry vines. When she'd come back, she'd wipe off the blood and the mud and say, "Oh, he's an old friend," or "He's got problems I should know about." That's just who she was.
Between 1937 and 1974, Congresswoman Julia Butler Hansen won 42 consecutive elections.
In the first session in 1939, a male legislator insulted another woman member. I don't know who it was, but anyway, my mother told the man to apologize, and he refused, and she said, "Well, you take your glasses off," and he looked kind of puzzled, and she said, "You take your glasses off," and he did, and she hit him.
When Julia won election to the state legislature in 1938, she entered a virtually all-male arena of politics.
She started out on the town council in tiny Cathlamet and ended up as the most powerful woman in the United States Congress. She championed self-determination for Native Americans, appropriating millions of dollars to improve their lives. She also built freeways, bridges, libraries, and schools.
And I was raised with one fundamental belief that every American had an obligation to serve in some way. It didn't matter how you served, but you should serve your country. It was just something that was implicit in my childhood.
Julia championed the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and in 1972, she helped push through the Equal Rights Amendment. In the twilight of her political career, Governor Evans appointed her to the State Highway Commission. She became its first female chairman.
In 1957, during my first year in the State House of Representatives, they were appointing members to the Joint Fact-Finding Committee on Highways, which was a very prestigious interim committee. And Julia, she wanted to appoint me, but it was a Republican seat. The Republican leader protested that a prestigious seat like that should not go to a freshman. Julia just looked at him with that marvelous glare and said, "Appoint him." I quickly developed enormous respect for this savvy, disarmingly plain-spoken woman. She was someone pretty special.
I think women shouldn't be afraid to face the future, no matter what their circumstances. And I didn't feel that I should be put aside because there wasn't any place in history at that point in time for women.
As a trailblazing female politician, Julia Butler Hansen was way ahead of the curve.
Wonderful.
Isn't that marvelous? One of the best things about that are the narrators. First, we hear Julia in her own voice, that nicotine-stained, wonderful, raspy voice that I can still conjure up calling me from Washington, D.C. on the telephone when I was a political reporter. And then we've got Kim Wyman, your Secretary of State, who hugely admires Julia Butler Hansen and was a great champion of giving me the time to do this book. And then Fawn Sharp, whom I've known since she was a teenager, who is the president of the Quinault Indian Nation, now the president of the National Congress of American Indians. So it was a real kick to do that promo. And Julia's own narration, when we found that excerpt from oral history interview that she'd done in the 1960s, it just really made the cake. Interestingly about Julia as a feminist, there was a biography, official biography done as part of a huge volume on female members of the United States Congress. And the only bone I had to pick with the PhD historian of the House was that she said that Julia really wasn't much of a feminist. Well, the truth was that she was an old guard feminist, a suffrage feminist, but she was still, she took umbrage at the notion of women's lib in the 1970s. She told her staff that she wished that women would shave their legs and shave their armpits and wear a girdle, and didn't much cotton to the notion of burning bras, that would ruin your figure, she said. But she, as the father of daughters and as the son of a single mom raised by a mother who adored Julia and aunt, I was interested to read something that she said. She said she got tired of the notion that women, she said that women were sick of being the bug on the end of a pin, weary of the notion that we should be something completely and startlingly different just because we're women. Don't try to get elected and just say, well, I'm a woman, vote for me because I'm a woman. I have a special kind of intuition or this or that or something else. That's stupid. But she also said that she learned early on in politics that women, her alleged sisters in arms, had a remarkable capacity of being jealous of other successful women. And in her diary, besides railing against some of the goofy men that she met, who she also had this wonderful interview with Julia and Margaret Chase Smith in the 1970s, and it was all about women's lib and stereotypes of women. And Julia said that she was tired of being described as grandmotherly and people pointing out that she had silver hair and that all these stereotypes about women, and that none of these reporters were writing about the men with pot bellies and thinning hair. And when they started doing that, that she would think that women had really made a step forward. So there's got to be a lot more questions here. This has been way too much monologue. And as I hope everyone can tell that, this, by the way, this is, I'll tell you something important. When I took this job 12 and a half years ago, Sam Reed, the then Secretary of State, hired me, and he said that he wanted to increase the impact of the oral history program rather than just putting out old Q&A kind of oral history, and to when the occasion arose, like with Governor Spellman and Booth Gardner and Senator Gorton and Billy Frank Jr., to name another of our biographies, that he wanted to do it and do it right, warts and all. And I said, so no hagiography, no politics. And he said, absolutely not. And Kim Wyman, true to her word, has been an absolute rock in that regard, that politics doesn't interfere or dictate what we write. Well, it's pretty amazing to think about Julia and her milieu and where we are today in that era, where in her era, when a session was over, people repaired to a watering hole like the legendary Monocle on Capitol Hill, and Gerald Ford was often in the same booth with her. They were drinking martinis and eating scallops and talking politics, and people got along. And Deanne Shaw, my dear friend and former colleague, says, I will just share with the group. What was that? It was fleeting there, Deanne.
Here, it says, I will just share with the group that as a young female reporter / editor who was the first female assigned to cover the Aberdeen City Council in the late 80s and early 90s, I heard many a story about Julia from my editor, John Hughes. Thank you, John, for supporting me when the powers to be didn't know what to do with a 20-something female with a journalism degree. Now I'm president of the Aberdeen City Council.
And a remarkable, remarkable president she is.
I want to interject here too, John, and urge everybody listening to get a hold of this book and read it, because Julia Butler Hansen is such an inspiring figure and somebody so many more people should know about. And you do a wonderful job with the narrative here, and not just Julia. You were talking about Scoop Jackson before we started. There's so many wonderful characters that come into this book, and it will send you off on so many paths of curiosity. I'm just, ready to go off on so many different people that come into this.
That's very kind of you to say. This was a real, my teammates at the Legacy Project really supported this project because it got finished in the middle of a pandemic, which turned out pretty well, because it encumbered our ability to go out and do as many oral histories as we normally do. And we're doing the Zooms and WebExes but it's not the same as being able to sit in the Hansen house and talk with David Hansen and see Maud Kimball Butler's watercolors. What I wanted to say that is otherwise overlooked is that Catherine May and Julia Butler Hansen in 1956, in concert with the Governor Rossellini and Marianne Reynolds, the state librarian, got the funds appropriated for the first purpose-built state library. Heretofore, it had been sort of in the basement with the law library in the Temple of Justice. In a repository, the Isaac Stevens collection, the core collection of those historic books I get to work now with some amazingly gifted librarians, genealogists, and archivists in the Office of the Secretary of State. And it's just a movable feast to have one floor down from my office, every newspaper since territorial days, and a lot of Oregon newspapers on microfilm, to have city directories and ships manifests and all the search engines of Ancestry.com and Newsbank, and it's all there. So you really couldn't do this job. But I guess I would like to say, whenever I get a chance to talk to people about doing oral history, we've also done some oral histories, thematic oral histories, with Korean War veterans and World War II veterans. And the piece that I just finished that should be posted here in the next 2 days is with a really remarkable woman named Alfie Alvarado Ramos, who is the director of the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs. And it's an oral history that as I was finishing Julia, I was working on Alfie's story as well, and I got to meet with Alfie in her war room, where VA officials from around the state and around the nation were desperately trying to keep our veterans alive and well in these nursing homes and protect them from the pandemic. And it's really a gripping story. So out there, I know all of us, my major regrets in life is that I never did an oral history with my own mother, who was a remarkable character, or with my Uncle Charles, who was a B-17 waist gunner in World War II. I grew up hearing his stories, but then when I became a newspaper man, I never really had the time to do those. And it's like old Ben putting it off. People who are listening now, new friends that I'm making out there that I hope to meet in person sometime soon at the Longview Library, where I have so many fond memories, to have a book signing or a book event there, but buy an $80 digital tape recorder, record your Uncle Charles, your mom, your Aunt Madge, the neighbor down the block who was in Vietnam, these are really great stories, and they're the building blocks of wonderful legacy for our families. This has been such a joy to get to talk with you tonight, with people in Cowlitz County, and I said when we did the podcast earlier, I was waiting for somebody to remind me what year it was, or also remember, as I do, that the year Lake Sacagawea froze over, and I can see my kid sister skating not far from the Congregational Church on frozen Lake Sacagawea. So I know that's not a figment of my imagination, but I've never seen a picture of that.
Well, thank you.
We're going to do our best to find one of those.
Yeah.
We've been talking about it. We will.
Yeah. We know we've got one in our building, but it's from like 1929 or something like that. But same kind of idea, people skating across on the lake, and we'll keep our eyes open. And so I just want to thank you, John, for being part of it. And I look forward to when we can have a live person event and have you come back and come to the Longview Library and, see what's going on now and be able to have another event. So I just want to thank you, and then thank everyone who participated tonight, and let you know that next month on, let's see, what is it, April, what's the date? Do you remember, Austin, for our next Northwest Voices?
It is April 21st, and it's going to be with Kathleen Flanagan.
There's Jennifer Nielsen, just checked in with a message. Jennifer, call me sometime. It was wonderful to hear her voice again, wasn't it? And boy, you knew her like few. I have to tell you, when I got off on that tangent, one last thing, when I gave the kudos to Sam and to Kim for saying that we're not going to write hagiography. Well, Julia's warts and all are in here. And as Alan Thompson and others recounted, she could be a horrible boss. She was so demanding and so mercurial, and like LBJ in that regard in a lot of ways. And her expectation was that she worked late and the staff had to stay until the boss lady left, and that you were expected to go to lunch with her, dinner with her, and if you were her administrative assistant, you tried at your peril to match martinis with her, although they never saw her drunk. She really, not only could she hold her liquor, she had like a 3 martini rule, and that didn't seem to dent her. But there was a whole fabulous story that David and maybe even Jennifer related, that one time there was a young staffer who was so frustrated at working for Julia that she faked a pregnancy to say that she was leaving, and Julia threw a shower for her. And I don't know whatever came of that, but on another occasion, somebody said they had to leave to go back home to get married and just wanted to get the hell out of there. But she found it very, very difficult to say, I'm sorry. And usually when things blew over, there would be a lot of other little mea culpa kindnesses that she made up for. She didn't forget birthdays. She didn't forget christenings, and there would be lovely gifts that arrived for children and grandchildren, but she was a hard person to work for. And I was on the visiting end on more than one occasion of her ire when she thought that the Aberdeen Daily World had written something that didn't please her. And oftentimes I had to say, I don't write the editorials. So call the publisher. So what a character. Thank you very much for having me. What a pleasure.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. So again, thank everybody for coming in tonight. As I said, look forward to information coming out soon about Kathleen Finnegan, the former Washington State Poet Laureate who visited us, what did we figure, 8 years ago?
Yeah, 8 or 9 years ago.
So it'll be good to have her back, and she has a new book that just came out. So for that, I'll just say good night.
Ask her to read Julia's poetry. Julia was a masterful poet.
Good
All
to
right.
know.
Yeah. Thank you, John, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Good night.